Ever pondered the question, how much does the world owe? Quite a thought, isn't it? The concept we're delving into today is global debt, a figure that seems to be ever increasing, and its role in the world economy. Now, global debt isn't simply the sum of all individual business and government debts in every country. It's a bit more complex than that. Global debt is the total amount of debt issued by all public and private sectors across the globe. It includes debts owed by households, businesses, governments, and even international organizations. It's a key indicator that economists use to gauge the health of the world's economy and to identify potential pressure points. But how do we make sense of these colossal numbers? Enter the debt-to-GDP ratio, a handy tool in the economist's kit. This ratio compares a country's public debt to its gross domestic product, or GDP. It's like comparing how much you owe on your credit card to your yearly income. This ratio helps economists understand how likely a country is to pay back its debt. The higher the ratio, the greater the risk. However, it's not as black and white as it seems. Sometimes a high debt-to-GDP ratio might not spell trouble. For instance, a country might borrow heavily to invest in infrastructure or education, which could fuel future economic growth. On the other hand, a low ratio might not always be a good sign. It could mean that a country isn't investing enough in its future. So, why is this important? Because when countries can't pay back their debts, it can lead to a domino effect, impacting global financial markets and potentially leading to economic crises. Now, with the foundation laid, we explore the intriguing journey of debt-to-GDP ratios since the dawn of the 21st century. As we turn the corner into the 21st century, the debt-to-GDP ratios told a fascinating story. The world was buzzing with the potential of a new millennium, yet beneath the surface, the global debt landscape was a complex tapestry. At the start of the 2000s, Japan held the unenviable title of the highest debt-to-GDP ratio, clocking in at over 200%. On the other end of the spectrum, we had countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, their ratios barely scratching the surface at less than 10%. In the middle, we had the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany, with their ratios hovering around 60%. These figures, while seemingly just numbers, were indicative of the economic health and fiscal policies of these nations. But as we know, the economic landscape is never static. As the new millennium progressed, these ratios began to shift dramatically. The year 2008 marked a turning point in global debt. The financial crisis that swept across the globe, originating from the United States, shook the very foundations of the world's economic stability. It was a cataclysmic event that sent shockwaves through the global financial system, causing a surge in debt-to-GDP ratios across the globe. So, what exactly happened? Well, the crisis arose from a dangerous cocktail of risky lending practices, high-risk mortgage loans, and the bursting of the United States housing bubble. Financial institutions worldwide were left exposed, leading to bank failures and government bailouts. These bailouts were a necessary evil. Governments across the globe had to step in to prevent a total collapse of the financial system. They pumped massive amounts of money into their economies to keep them afloat. But this came at a cost. It led to a significant increase in government debt, as countries borrowed heavily to finance these emergency measures. For instance, in a bid to halt the financial meltdown, the US government implemented a $700 billion bailout plan known as the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. This move alone substantially increased the US debt-to-GDP ratio. Similarly, across the pond in Europe, countries like Greece, Spain, and Ireland also saw their debt-to-GDP ratios skyrocket as they grappled with their own financial crises and bank bailouts. Now you might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, high debt-to-GDP ratios can have serious implications for a country's economic health. They can lead to higher interest rates, reduced investment, and slower economic growth. In some cases, they can even trigger a debt crisis, as we saw in Greece. In a nutshell, the 2008 financial crisis marked a seismic shift in global debt. It was a wake-up call for many countries, highlighting the dangers of excessive borrowing and the importance of maintaining a healthy debt-to-GDP ratio. Post-2008, the world of debt was never quite the same. The crisis fundamentally altered the landscape of global debt, leaving a lasting impact on economies worldwide. And as we'll see in the next scene, this was just the beginning of a trend that would continue in the years to come. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, global debt took a steep hike. This period, marked by economic turbulence, saw the world grappling to regain financial stability. Yet it was during this time that the debt-to-GDP ratios of many nations began to climb at an alarming rate. In the wake of the 2008 crisis, countries worldwide implemented various fiscal policies to stimulate their economies. However, these policies often required massive public spending, leading to an increase in public debt. As a consequence, the debt-to-GDP ratio, a key indicator of a country's economic health, began to soar. Let's take a closer look at some of the countries that bore the brunt of this debt surge. Among the most affected were nations like Greece, Italy, and Japan, each with their unique set of circumstances. Greece, for instance, faced a severe debt crisis due to excessive borrowing and spending, while Italy's high public debt was largely attributed to its slow economic growth. Japan, on the other hand, has been battling deflation for decades, leading to an astronomical debt-to-GDP ratio. But why is a high debt-to-GDP ratio cause for concern? Well, in simple terms, it means that a country owes more than it produces. A high ratio indicates that a nation might struggle to pay off its debts, potentially leading to a debt crisis. And as we've seen in the past, such a crisis can have far-reaching effects, impacting not just the indebted country, but the global economy at large. So, as we navigated the post-crisis period, this rising debt became a significant global concern. Economists, policymakers, and financial analysts were left to grapple with the question, how do we manage this mounting debt while fostering economic growth? And then, just when we thought we'd seen it all, the world was hit by a global pandemic. COVID-19, a name that will forever be etched in our memory, also had a profound impact on global debt. As the virus spread across the globe, bringing economies to a standstill, governments responded with massive spending programs to prop up businesses and individuals facing hardship. This action, while necessary, led to a sharp increase in public debt worldwide. Countries, both developed and developing, saw their debt-to-GDP ratios skyrocket as they borrowed heavily to fund their pandemic response. The International Monetary Fund reported that the global public debt reached a record high of nearly 100% of world GDP in 2020. This was the largest single-year increase since World War II. In the United States, for example, the debt-to-GDP ratio jumped from around 106% in 2019 to nearly 130% in 2020. The European Union saw a similar trend, with the ratio rising from around 84% to almost 98% in the same period. This surge in debt was not limited to high-income countries. Many emerging market and developing economies also saw their debt levels rise. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, the average debt-to-GDP ratio increased from around 50% in 2019 to over 60% in 2020. The reason for this global increase in debt is simple. Governments had to spend more to protect their citizens and economies from the devastating effects of the pandemic. This spending was financed largely through borrowing, leading to higher debt levels. As we begin to see the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel, we are left with a global economy burdened by high levels of debt. This debt will need to be managed carefully to avoid a potential financial crisis in the future. The challenge for governments will be to balance debt reduction with economic growth and social welfare. As we navigate the post-pandemic world, the question remains: what does the future hold for global debt? From the turn of the century to the present day, the journey of debt-to-GDP ratios has been nothing short of a roller coaster ride. At the dawn of the new millennium, we saw a relatively stable global debt landscape. However, the financial crisis of 2008 sent shockwaves through economies worldwide, pushing these ratios to new heights. The post-crisis period was no respite, as it brought with it a surge in global debt. Then came the pandemic, a black swan event that further exacerbated the debt situation. Governments everywhere ramped up borrowing to cushion their economies from the unprecedented crisis, leading to soaring debt-to-GDP ratios. Just like a roller coaster, the journey has been exhilarating, filled with ups and downs. But as we disembark this ride, let's not forget the larger picture. As we continue to watch the world of global debt, one fact remains clear: understanding these ratios is key to grasping the health of our global economy.